A few historical things to place some things also in context here, very important. I want to focus just a couple of points here in the shorter part two video on the rhetorical force of Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman, or Ain't I a Woman Too? A lot of people don't realize this. You covered this very briefly in U.S. history class back when you're a junior in high school, and sometimes that's about all some people get these days. But the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 was passed. When it was passed, I should say, there were all these different attempts at compromise, right? What was going on in the country is essentially, as the West was being settled, the big debate was the balance of power in Congress. Everybody knew that the northern states, if they ever outvoted the southern states, would vote slavery away. And so the South had a vested interest in making sure that westward expansion meant the expansion of slavery, at least with a 50-50 balance, so that they could continue that institution. So you get things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was a patch on a tire that was already worn out. The opportunity to compromise on this issue was pretty much nil. Honestly, they tried to compromise. Missouri Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Missouri Compromise and all these different kinds of things just led to more violence and more disagreement, because the fundamental question was, one, are these people human beings? Which to us is patently on its face an obvious, almost a rhetorical question. But more importantly, if you answer that question as yes, they are people and they are not property, then everything else follows from that. I mean, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, everything follows from that. And the fiction of continuing to see these people as property is something that Southern slave owners simply weren't interested in going down that road. They just didn't want to do that. So you have this series of compromises that are really just kind of kicking the can down the road, as they say, and prolonging things. A tipping point, two or three tipping points came about. First tipping point came about with the Fugitive Slave Act, which essentially, and you can see a tract down there written by Samuel May Jr. Against it. The Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. Prior to this act, for the most part, if a slave escaped and got across the Mason-Dixon line, she or he could be granted essentially asylum and not be forced back into slavery and servitude back down south. They were free. You made it to Indiana, or you made it to New York, or you made it to Pennsylvania, you were free. You were guaranteed to be okay. They couldn't bring you back by force without violating the law. But the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, it designed to keep the South in the Union, to appease the South, basically. The agreement was, well, if you'll stay in the Union and agree to these compromises and this plan for westward expansion, etc., the Fugitive Slave Act meant that anybody up north in a non-slave state, in a free state, who harbored an escaped slave from the South could be subject to federal criminal penalties. That's a different story. It's one thing, if you're a white northerner, it's one thing to say, well, this is something that's not my business. It's not my fight. I'm not from the South. I don't want to get involved, etc. It's another thing entirely to say that if you don't help capture slaves, or if one comes to you and asks you for refuge, you can't give it. This was seen as just simply a bridge too far by many people, because what it said was you have to assist and aid in the perpetuation of slavery as an institution. People up north basically said, wait a minute, hold on a minute. It's one thing for those folks down in Georgia to have slavery, but you can't make me enforce their slavery institution by making me, I have a moral right to say no to returning somebody who's on my property, in my home, a guest in my home. It would make you a criminal. That hence the Underground Railway, right? The Underground Railroad was having to hide people all the way up to Canada. Now you had to go all the way to Canada if you were an escaped slave. This was just seen by Northerners as, okay, the South has just simply gone too far. Because they constantly threatened and huffed and puffed and said, we'll leave the Union, we'll leave the Union. And there are many Northerners who said, well, if you're going to drag us into being complicit in slavery and helping you enforce your immoral institutions, you might as well leave. We don't want to have anything to do with you or your institution, either one. That was a huge thing. The other thing is the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which we'll talk about a little bit later on this week, as I post a commentary on that one. It's a very long novel, so I hope you're reading. And its popularity, big thing. But the most important thing is every presidential cycle, a pro-slavery president was elected because of the balance of the Electoral College and all that sort of thing. It was very rare to find a prior to the Civil War, an anti-slavery president. At the very least, they tacitly accepted it, if not outright supported slavery. So there was no attempt on the part of the executive branch. The executive branch wouldn't do it anyway. In the 19th century, prior to Lincoln, the executive branch was largely a kind of a ribbon-cutting position. The president really was not that powerful until after the Civil War. It wasn't seen as a terribly powerful position in some respects. So there was not going to be executive action. Legislative attempts like the Missouri Compromise and the Kansas-Nebraska Act and all these kinds of things failed one right after another. So there was not going to be a legislative solution to it. There's only three branches of government, folks, and so the third branch of government, the judicial, with the Dred Scott decision, and that's Dred Scott in the lower left-hand corner there, went all the way to the Supreme Court. Because it was a result of the Fugitive Slave Act. He got returned back down there, and they sued and went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, headed up by Supreme Court Justice Taney, who was a rabidly pro-slavery man, said, quote, "A black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect," end quote. That's a part of the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott decision's universally seen as the very worst decision the United States Supreme Court ever handed down. And what it did in 1857 is it sealed our fate. It meant that there was going to be no solution from any branch of government that was going to stop this, and the South was simply not going to give up on their demand of continuing to expand slavery into the West. They were running into geographical problems, though, because slavery was essentially an agrarian agricultural phenomenon, and you just don't have the ability out in Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California, nor the need for mass forced labor in agricultural settings. Who's gonna start a plantation in the Rocky Mountains? Who's gonna do it in Yuma, Arizona? Not gonna happen, right? So geography was working against them anyway, and they saw that and they decided, we're leaving. With the election of Lincoln, we're leaving because he's a pro-union, pro-union force, and was at least tacitly anti-slavery. Although it's very important to realize that in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln was not expressly against slavery. He was for preserving the Union with slavery, without slavery, or part slavery and part free. That's what he said in his speeches, that he wanted to preserve the Union no matter what. He was not first and foremost an abolitionist. Only when the war was going on did he really start shifting his opinion and become much more ardently abolitionist. So it took some people, even Lincoln, who was considered a hero by many, possibly the greatest president we ever had, took him time to come around to things. This was the hot question of the day, obviously. And in fact, it's such an important period of time in the country's history. It even affected the way we call ourselves. To give you an example, prior to the Civil War, the proper way to refer to our country and to talk about the United States is you would say the United States of America are a country, instead of what we would say today, which is the United States of America is a country. That shift right there, the United States are versus the United States is, shows you what happened. It was a shift between we all live in our home states and we happen to belong to this federation of states versus seeing ourselves as a single country. The Civil War did that to us and changed the way we viewed ourselves as a people. Now, with all that as a backdrop, I want to dive into just basically the rhetorical force in this and just bring a couple of highlights. Of course, there is a significant question over the authenticity of the text compared to the original speech. The text we have differs in many regards to the initial version that was published immediately after the speech was given. Okay, there's no question about that. And you can go and kind of look into that. Remember, this was a heated political issue, the heated political issue of the day. People are going to do whatever they need to do to win a political argument over something this essential to the lifeblood of the American political system. So it wouldn't surprise me at all that the text, this text that we have today, Ain't I a Woman Too, is, an improvement, one might even say, to be kind, over what she originally said. Because what she originally said was largely transcribed in one version, and then later it came out in a later version, and that's what most people read. They don't read the original version. It was changed up quite a bit. In fact, in the first published version of the speech, the first published account of the speech, she doesn't even use the phrase "Ain't I a woman?" And so you can go back and take a look at all that. It doesn't really matter, because what really matters to me is this text as historical and rhetorical artifact, because someone crafted it, someone improved it. Maybe she gave the speech, and then later someone sat down with her and said, let's make this even more effective than the way it was delivered, kind of as an extemporaneous, off-the-cuff thing. So it becomes a polished thing. It enters sort of the hall of fame of American mythology in some respects, like the George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. Did George Washington as a child really chop down a cherry tree and say, "I cannot tell a lie"? Who cares, right? Because what matters is the fact that it's part of who we are as a people now, our mythos, and so is this text. So there's all that, and you can just argue until you're upside down if you want to about it, but it doesn't really matter in some respects, because as a text it functions really interestingly. First, the major argument is about our shared humanity. When she says that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me the best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I've plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? Right? That anaphora again and again, the repetition. Okay. I have borne 13 children, et cetera, et cetera. Ain't I a woman? I'm a woman too, right? And you see that slave token down at the abolition token, down at the bottom of the screen here. Am I not a woman and a sister? This was an anti-slavery token that people would give out at rallies. That one's from 1838. The constantly reiterating the shared humanity. That's the first argument. You cannot deny my humanity. I'm sitting here talking to you. I'm a person, not property. Okay. The second thing is in this text, I think, which is, I wouldn't say subtle, but doesn't beat you over the head. The counter argument that's in here against the supposed inferior intellect of slaves. She says they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? Member of the audience whispers, intellect. That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Right? In other words, it doesn't matter whether my capacity in some regards is less than yours. I'm still entitled under the Constitution, under any sense of fairness, to develop to my fullest. So let's say that a person who, is challenged with respect to language or mathematics or something like that, well, no, that person may not become an engineer, but they're entitled to become whatever they can be. And so what she's arguing here is against those who say, well, African Americans, they don't have the same intellectual ability and all these going back to phrenology and craniology and all these cockamamie, cockeyed sort of theories of human development and all these kinds of things. She says, but even if that were the case, even if that were the case, who's to argue that I shouldn't be allowed to develop into my full potential? I may not have learned how to read and write as a young person, but I'm still entitled to what I'm entitled to, and that's my rights. And then there's a religious counter argument against sort of the biblical basis for slavery. You know, it is very common knowledge that many churches preach that slavery was sanctioned by the Bible, that it was okay because it's biblically authorized for slavery. But she argues against that and says, then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with it. It's right. Joseph was largely not the major player, shall we say, in the conception of Christ. He says, if the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down and all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and to get it right side up again. And now now they is asking to do it. The men better let them. And so what she's saying here is, I don't want to hear your biblical arguments in favor of or justifying slavery. There are a lot of biblical arguments that you can make that would say it was a horrible thing, right? And that women and people of different races other than just the white race are as entitled as anybody else to God's grace and to the blessings of liberty. And so she said, this is very now. And again, you can argue all day long. Did she come up with all this? Did she give the speech off the cuff and then maybe somebody came to her and said, what was that speech you gave? And it's like, well, I mean, I kind of sort of, and then she goes and says, you know, she can't recall exactly what the extemporaneous was. Who could? You know, your recollection of it later is going to be a little bit different than it was, or maybe you're going to say, well, what I wish I had said, or, you know, it doesn't matter, you know, in the final analysis. What matters is what we have, the text, how powerful it is, how much impact it had at the time in 1851. Now, speaking of which, we're going to talk about the impact of the novel that is still considered the most widely read novel in the history of the United States. Certainly on a per capita basis. More people read this novel than any other novel before or since, and that's Uncle Tom's Cabin. A novel that Abraham Lincoln is supposed to have remarked to Harriet Beecher Stowe and is supposed to have referenced when he said to her, so you're the little lady who started this great big war. I don't know if that was true. Maybe it's apocrypha, but legend has it he said that. Anyway, it's an interesting, fascinating novel. It's not a novel that you need to read word for word. It's a long novel, but if you read it right, you can read it as a quick read and scan through it, and you'll get the same amount of information out of it as you would if you read it word for word and line for line. We'll cover that next week in our commentary, and we'll talk to you then.